The coffee shop on K Street had always prided itself on serving Washington, D.C.'s elite. Politicians, lobbyists, and power brokers lined up each morning for their artisanal lattes and organic pastries, discussing deals that would reshape the world over $20 breakfast sandwiches. But on this particular Tuesday morning, their carefully curated atmosphere would be shattered by a woman they never saw coming. She stood outside the gleaming glass doors, her weather hands pressed against the cold surface, as she peered inside at the warmth and luxury she'd once known so intimately. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been many things in her 72 years: a Harvard-educated economist, a former Secretary of the Treasury, a woman who had sat in the Situation Room during 3 different international crises. But today, she was simply a homeless woman trying to get out of the December cold. Welcome to those who left a trace. Before we dive into this extraordinary story of fall from grace and ultimate redemption, tell me in the comments, what city in the world are you watching from today? And if you believe that dignity exists regardless of circumstances, hit that subscribe button. These stories remind us that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places. Elena pulled her tattered coat tighter around her shoulders and pushed through the heavy door. The immediate blast of warm air mixed with the rich aroma of coffee beans felt like a gift from heaven. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the gnawing hunger in her stomach had become a constant companion. All she needed was a simple cup of coffee, and perhaps a moment to sit somewhere warm. The morning rush was in full swing. Men in $1,000 suits barked orders into their phones, while women in designer heels tapped impatiently on marble countertops. Everyone was in a hurry. Everyone was important. Everyone belonged, except for the elderly woman in the dirty coat who had just walked in from the street. "Excuse me, ma'am," came a sharp voice from behind the counter. The barista, a young man named Trevor with perfectly styled hair and an expression of practiced condescension, had spotted Elena immediately. "Are you lost? This is a private establishment." Elena looked up at him, her dark eyes still carrying the intelligence and dignity that had once commanded respect in the world's most powerful boardrooms. "I'd like to purchase a cup of coffee, please." Trevor's laugh was cruel and theatrical, designed to draw attention from the other customers. "Ma'am, our coffee starts at $8. Our pastries are $12. I don't think this is a place for you." Several customers had turned to watch the interaction, their expressions ranging from amusement to disgust. Elena felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but she had learned to endure worse in the 3 years since her fall from grace. "I have money," Elena said quietly, reaching into her coat pocket to produce a crumpled $20 bill. It represented most of her remaining cash, saved from collecting aluminum cans and accepting the occasional charity of strangers. Trevor stared at the wrinkled bill as if it were contaminated. "Look, lady, we have a dress code here. Health regulations. You can't just walking off the street looking like that." The morning customers were fully engaged now, smartphones discreetly recording what they assumed would be an entertaining confrontation. Elena noticed a young woman in a business suit snickering to her friend. "Can you believe this?" Security should have stopped her at the door. "Please," Elena said, her voice maintaining its dignity despite the circumstances. "I just need something warm to drink." "And I need you to leave," Trevor replied, his voice growing louder. "You're making our customers uncomfortable. This is a respectable establishment." What Trevor didn't know was that Elena had designed the economic policies that had helped stabilize the American economy during the 2008 financial crisis. She had negotiated trade agreements that had saved thousands of jobs. She had sat across from presidents and prime ministers, her advice sought by world leaders facing their darkest hours. But that was before the diagnosis, before the medical bills that consumed her life savings, before the experimental treatments that showed promise but ultimately failed, before her husband's death left her alone and financially ruined, before the sequence of events that had transformed one of America's most respected economists into a forgotten woman sleeping in doorways. "Sir," Elena said, her voice carrying a trace of the authority she'd once wielded, "I'm simply requesting to purchase a beverage. I have the money, and I'm not causing any disturbance." Trevor's manager, a woman named Patricia Collins who had worked at the coffee shop for 6 months and thought she understood the rhythms of DC's power structure, emerged from the back office. She took one look at Elena and immediately sided with her employee. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Patricia said, her voice cold and professional. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone, and frankly, your appearance doesn't meet our standards." Elena felt the weight of every eye in the coffee shop on her. She had faced down hostile congressional committees, negotiated with dictators, and stood firm against economic forces that could have destroyed millions of lives. But in this moment, surrounded by the privileged and the powerful who have forgotten that dignity isn't determined by circumstances, she felt smaller than she had in years. "Very well," Elena said, folding the $20 bill back into her pocket. "I apologize for any inconvenience." As she turned to leave, she heard Patricia speaking loudly to Trevor, clearly intending for everyone to hear. "We need to be more careful about who we let in here. This is a business establishment, not a homeless shelter." The laughter from the customers followed Elena out the door, but she maintained her composure until she reached the sidewalk. Only then did she allow herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. She had been reduced to a problem to be solved, a disturbance to be removed, a person whose worth was measured solely by her appearance. Elena walked slowly down K Street, her feet aching in shoes that had long since lost their soles. The December wind cut through her coat like a knife, and she pulled it tighter around her body. She found a bench in a small park 2 blocks away and sat down, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't the first time she'd been turned away from a business, but it never got easier. Each rejection was a reminder of how far she'd fallen, how completely she'd disappeared from the world that had once valued her so highly. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be Dr. Elena Vasquez, to have her opinions matter, to be treated with respect. 3 years ago, she had been preparing for her retirement, planning to write a book about economic policy and perhaps teach at a university. Her husband, Carlos, had been looking forward to traveling, to spending time with their grandchildren, to enjoying the fruits of a lifetime of public service. The diagnosis had changed everything. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The words had hit them like a physical blow, but Elena was a fighter. She had always been a fighter. She liquidated her savings, mortgaged their home, and threw everything into experimental treatments. For a while, it seemed like it might work. The tumors shrank. The doctors were optimistic, and Elena began to believe she might beat the odds. But cancer doesn't care about your achievements or your determination. The disease returned with a vengeance, and the treatments that had once shown promise began to fail. Carlos had mortgaged their house a second time, borrowed against his pension, and sold everything they owned to pay for treatments that ultimately proved futile. When Elena finally accepted that she was dying, she and Carlos had nothing left. No savings, no home, no financial security. They moved into a small apartment, then a motel room, then finally into Carlos's old pickup truck. Elena was too weak to work, and Carlos was too old to find employment that would cover their basic needs. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent her career managing the finances of the world's most powerful nation, but she couldn't manage her own financial survival. She had advised presidents on economic policy, but she couldn't afford her own medical care. She had been celebrated for her expertise and fiscal responsibility, but she had been forced to make impossible choices between treatment and survival. Carlos had died first, succumbing to a heart attack brought on by stress and exhaustion. Elena had been left alone, facing her own mortality with no resources and no support system. The treatments had failed, but somehow she had survived. The cancer had gone into remission, but by then she had lost everything. Now, sitting on a park bench in the shadow of the Capitol building, Elena tried to reconcile the woman she had been with the woman she had become. The city around her buzzed with the energy of power and influence, but she had become invisible to the very people who had once sought her counsel. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, she didn't notice the black sedan that had pulled up across the street. She didn't see the man in the dark suit who emerged from the vehicle and began walking toward her. She didn't recognize the Secret Service agent who had spent the last hours searching for her based on a tip from a concerned citizen who had witnessed a coffee shop incident. "Dr. Vasquez?" The voice was respectful, almost reverent. Elena looked up to see a man in his 30s, his bearing unmistakably military, his expression one of profound respect. "I'm sorry," Elena said, confused. "I think you have me confused with someone else." "Ma'am, I'm Agent Mitchell with the Secret Service. The President of the United States would like to speak with you." Elena stared at him, certain she was hallucinating. "The President? I think there's been a mistake." Agent Mitchell smiled gently. "No mistake, ma'am. President Harrison has been looking for you for quite some time. If you'll come with me, I'll take you to him." Elena looked around, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate joke or perhaps a sign that her mind was finally beginning to fail. But Agent Mitchell's expression was serious, and the black sedan waiting across the street looked very real. "I don't understand," Elena said. "Why would the president want to see me?" "Ma'am, with respect, I think that the conversation you should have with him directly. Will you come with me?" Elena hesitated. She had nothing left to lose, and if this was some kind of mistake, at least she would be warm for a few more minutes. She nodded slowly, and Agent Mitchell helped her to her feet with a gentleness that had been absent from her life for far too long. As they walked toward the sedan, Elena couldn't help but glance back at the coffee shop where she had been so humiliated just an hour earlier. She had no idea that within the next few hours, her story would become a national sensation, and the people who had laughed at her would learn exactly who they had turned away. The ride to the White House was surreal. Elena sat in the back of the sedan, tried to process what was happening while Agent Mitchell made quiet calls to coordinate their arrival. She hadn't been inside a vehicle this luxurious in years, and the simple pleasure of being warm and safe felt almost overwhelming. "Agent Mitchell," Elena said quietly, "I think there's been some kind of mistake. I'm nobody important. I'm just a homeless woman." Agent Mitchell turned to look at her, his expression kind but firm. "Dr. Vasquez, with all due respect, you're one of the most important people in America. The president has been trying to locate you for months." Elena shook her head. "I don't understand. I haven't been relevant to anything in years." "Ma'am, you designed the economic framework that prevented the 2008 financial crisis from becoming a complete economic collapse. Your policies saved millions of jobs and prevented a global depression. The president has been implementing modified versions of your strategies to address the current economic challenges." Elena stared out the window at the familiar streets of Washington, memories flooding back at the time when she had traveled these same routes in official vehicles, when her opinions had mattered, when she had been part of the machinery that kept the country running. "That was a long time ago," she said softly. "Good policy is timeless," Agent Mitchell replied, "and the president needs your expertise now more than ever." As they approached the White House, Elena felt a mixture of anxiety and disbelief. She was acutely aware of her appearance. The dirty coat, the worn shoes, the smell of someone who had been living on the streets. How could she possibly meet the president looking like this? Agent Mitchell seemed to read her thoughts. "Dr. Vasquez, the president is aware of your current circumstances. He's not meeting with you because of how you look. He's meeting with you because of who you are and what you know." The security process was expedited in a way that Elena remembered from her own time in government. Within minutes, she found herself walking through the West Wing, past staffers who looked at her with curiosity rather than the disgust she had grown accustomed to on the streets. A young aide approached them with a warm smile. "Dr. Vasquez, the president is waiting for you in the Oval Office. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Something to eat?" Elena almost laughed at the irony. An hour ago, she had been refused service at a coffee shop. Now, she was being offered refreshments in the White House. "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." As they walked toward the Oval Office, Elena tried to prepare herself for what was about to happen. She had met presidents before, but never in these circumstances. Never as a homeless woman who had been forgotten by the world. The doors to the Oval Office opened, and President Katherine Harrison stood up from behind the famous resolute desk. She was younger than Elena had expected, perhaps in her late 50s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had earned her position through intelligence and determination. "Dr. Vasquez," President Harrison said, walking around the desk with her hand extended. "It's an honor to meet you. I've been studying your work for years." Elena shook the president's hand, still struggling to believe this was really happening. "Madam President, I'm not sure why you want to see me." "Please, sit down," President Harrison said, gesturing to one of the chairs near the fireplace. "I wanted to see you because I need your help. The country needs your help." Elena sat down slowly, her legs still weak from malnutrition and exhaustion. The president sat across from her, her expression serious but warm. "Dr. Vasquez, I'm going to be direct with you. The economic policies you developed during your tenure as Secretary of the Treasury are the foundation of how we're addressing the current fiscal crisis. But I need someone who truly understands the nuances of those policies to help guide us through the next phase." Elena felt overwhelmed. "Madam President, I appreciate your confidence, but I haven't been involved in economic policy for years. I'm not sure I'm the right person for whatever you're asking." "You're exactly the right person," President Harrison said firmly. "Your policies saved this country once. I believe they can save it again. But I need your expertise, your insight, your experience." Elena looked around the Oval Office, taking the familiar symbols of power and authority. "Madam President, I need to be honest with you. I'm not the same person I was when I held office. I've been homeless for 3 years. I've been living on the streets, struggling to survive. I don't know if I still have the capacity to contribute at the level you're suggesting." President Harrison leaned forward, her expression compassionate but determined. "Dr. Vasquez, I know about your struggles. I know about your husband's death, your medical bills, your financial ruin. None of that changes the fact that you have one of the most brilliant economic minds in American history. Your circumstances don't diminish your capabilities." Elena felt tears welling up her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with respect, since anyone had acknowledged her worth as a human being. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help me," President Harrison said. "Say you'll come back and serve your country again. Not because you need the work, but because the country needs you." Elena was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what was being offered. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to serve as my special advisor on economic policy. I'm asking you to help me navigate the most complex financial challenges this country has faced in decades. I'm asking you to be part of the solution." Elena looked at the president, seeing sincerity in her eyes. "Madam President, I've been living on the streets. I don't have a home. I don't have clothes appropriate for this kind of work. I don't have any of the resources I would need to take on such a responsibility." "We'll take care of all of that," President Harrison said. "Housing, wardrobe, medical care, everything you need to get back on your feet. But most importantly, we'll give you the platform to make a difference again." Elena felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years. "Hope, you're serious about this?" "Dead serious," President Harrison replied. "Dr. Vasquez, I've been president for 2 years, and I've studied your policies extensively. The framework you developed for economic stabilization is exactly what we need right now. But I need someone who understands the theoretical foundations and the practical implications. I need you." Elena closed her eyes, trying to process everything that was happening. 3 hours ago, she had been turned away from a coffee shop. Now she was being offered a position as one of the most powerful economic advisors in the country. "There's something else," President Harrison said. "I want you to know that I'm aware of what happened at the coffee shop this morning. Agent Mitchell briefed me on the situation." Elena felt a flush of embarrassment. "I'm sorry you had to hear about that. It was humiliating." "You have nothing to be sorry for," President Harrison said, her voice carrying an edge of anger. "What happened to you was inexcusable. No one should be treated that way, regardless of their circumstances." Elena looked up at the president, surprised by the intensity of her response. It's not the first time something like that has happened. When you're homeless, you become invisible to most people. They see you as a problem to be solved or a disturbance to be removed. "That's about to change," President Harrison said. "I want you to know that I'm personally going to address what happened this morning. No one should be judged solely by their appearance or their circumstances." Elena felt a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. What do you mean? I mean that the people who treated you with such disrespect are about to learn who they turned away. And I think it's important for the American people to understand that dignity and worth aren't determined by someone's housing status or their financial situation. President Harrison stood up and walked to her desk, picking up a phone. Agent Mitchell, could you please call the media relations team? I want to schedule a press conference for this afternoon. Elena felt a surge of panic. Madam President, I don't think I'm ready for that kind of attention. You may not feel ready, but the country needs to hear your story. People need to understand that homelessness can happen to anyone, even the most accomplished and respected members of society. And they need to know that worth isn't determined by circumstances. As if on cue, Elena's stomach growled audibly. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the stress of the morning had made her even more aware of her hunger. President Harrison noticed immediately. Dr. Vasquez, when was the last time you ate? Elena hesitated, embarrassed. It's been a while. Agent Mitchell, President Harrison called out, could you please have the kitchen prepare something for Dr. Vasquez? Something substantial. Within minutes, a White House staff member arrived with a tray of food, soup, sandwich, fruit, and coffee. Elena looked at the meal with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Please eat, President Harrison said. We have a lot of work to do, and you need your strength. As Elena ate, President Harrison outlined her vision for the economic initiatives she wanted to implement. The more she talked, the more Elena recognized the policies she had developed years earlier, now adapted for current circumstances. These are sophisticated implementations, Elena said, her mind beginning to engage with the complex economic concepts. You've updated the framework to account for current market conditions, but the underlying principles are sound. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. President Harrison replied, but I need someone who can help me refine these policies, someone who can anticipate the unintended consequences and help me navigate the political implications. Elena felt her mind sharpening, the intellectual challenges beginning to override her exhaustion and malnutrition. The primary risk in the current implementation is the potential for inflation if the monetary policy adjustments aren't carefully calibrated with the fiscal interventions. President Harrison smiled. That's exactly the kind of insight I need. Dr. Vasquez, you may have been living on the streets, but your mind is as sharp as ever. Elena looked at the president, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. When would you want me to start? How about right now? President Harrison said, I have a meeting with the Federal Reserve Board this afternoon. I'd like you to be there. Elena looked down at her dirty clothes, her worn shoes. Her appearance had been deemed unsuitable for a coffee shop. I don't think I'm dressed appropriately for a meeting with the Federal Reserve Board. Dr. Vasquez, you're dressed like someone who has overcome extraordinary challenges and is ready to serve her country. I can't think of anything more appropriate than that. As Elena prepared to re-enter the world of high-stakes economic policy, she couldn't help but think about the coffee shop employees who had turned her away just hours earlier. They had no idea that the woman they had dismissed as worthless was about to become one of the most influential people in America. The president's press conference was scheduled for 3 p.m., and Elena knew that by the end of the day, the entire country would know her story. The homeless woman who had been refused service would be revealed as one of America's most brilliant economic minds. But more than that, her story would serve as a reminder that dignity and worth aren't determined by circumstances, and that sometimes the most powerful people in the room are the ones that others never see coming. The press conference was scheduled for 3 p.m., but by 2:30, word had already begun to leak through Washington's gossip networks. Reporters were making frantic calls, trying to understand why the president had called an emergency briefing about economic policy and social justice. What they didn't know was that they were about to witness one of the most extraordinary moments in recent political history. Elena had been given access to a White House bathroom where she could clean up, and a staff member had provided her with a simple but dignified outfit: a navy blazer, white blouse, and gray slacks. It wasn't designer clothing, but it was clean and professional. More importantly, it allowed her to feel like Dr. Elena Vasquez again. rather than the invisible homeless woman she had been that morning. As she looked at herself in the mirror, Elena was struck by how quickly her circumstances had changed. 8 hours ago, she had been sleeping on a park bench. Now she was preparing to address the nation from the White House. The transformation was so surreal that she wondered if she was dreaming. President Harrison knocked on the door. "Dr. Vasquez, are you ready?" Elena took a deep breath. "As ready as I can be, Madam President. Before we go out there, I want you to know that I've made some calls. The coffee shop incident this morning has been brought to my attention officially. I've spoken with the owner, and I think you'll find the resolution satisfactory." Elena looked at the president with curiosity. "What kind of resolution?" "You'll see," President Harrison said with a slight smile. "Sometimes the most effective way to address injustice is to let the truth speak for itself." The press briefing room was packed with reporters from major networks, newspapers, and online publications. Elena could feel their eyes on her as she entered the room with President Harrison, and she knew they were trying to figure out who she was and why she was there. President Harrison approached the podium with Elena standing beside her. The room fell silent as the president began to speak. "Good afternoon. I've called this press conference to address an issue that goes to the heart of who we are as Americans. This morning, a brilliant economist, a former Secretary of the Treasury, and one of the most respected public servants in our nation's history, was refused service at a coffee shop here in Washington, D.C. She was told she didn't meet their standards. She was humiliated and turned away not because of anything she had done, but because of how she looked." A murmur ran through the room as reporters began to understand the significance of what they were hearing. "The woman standing beside me is Dr. Elena Vasquez. She served as Secretary of the Treasury under 3 different administrations. She designed the economic policies that prevented the 2008 financial crisis from becoming a complete economic collapse. She has advised presidents, worked with world leaders, and quite literally saved millions of American jobs." Elena felt the weight of every eye in the room on her. She had been in similar situations before, but never under these circumstances. "Dr. Vasquez has been homeless for the past 3 years," President Harrison continued. "She lost everything fighting pancreatic cancer, tried to save her own life and care for her dying husband. She fell for the cracks of our social safety net, and she has been living on the streets of our nation's capital, while we in Washington have been implementing economic policies that she originally designed." The room was completely silent now. Elena could see the expressions of the reporters changing from curiosity to shock to something that looked like shame. This morning, as she tried to purchase a cup of coffee with her own money, she was told that she didn't belong in a respectable establishment. She was treated as if she were less than human, as if her worth could be measured by her appearance rather than her character or her contributions to society. President Harrison turned to Elena. "Dr. Vasquez, would you like to say something?" Elena stepped forward to the microphone, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Thank you, Madam President. I want to be clear that I'm not here seeking sympathy or special treatment. I'm here because the president has asked me to serve my country again, and I believe that public service is a privilege, not a right." She paused, looking out at the room full of reporters. "I also want to say that what happened to me this morning happens to homeless people every day across this country. We are treated as if we are invisible, as if we are problems to be solved rather than human beings with dignity and worth. My experience is not unique. I'm only standing here because I happen to have had a previous career that the president values." Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued. "But every person experiencing homelessness has a story. Every person living on the streets has value. Every person who has fallen through the cracks of our society deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. I hope that my story can serve as a reminder that circumstances don't determine worth, and that we need to do better as a society." A reporter raised her hand. "Dr. Vasquez, what would you say to the people who refused you service this morning?" Elena thought for a moment. "I would say that they were doing what they thought was right based on their limited understanding of the situation. I don't hold any personal animosity toward them, but I would hope that they and others like them might learn from this experience that appearances can be deceiving and that every person deserves to be treated with respect regardless of their circumstances. President Harrison stepped back to the microphone. I want to address the broader implications of Dr. Vasquez's story. We are facing economic challenges that require the best minds our country has to offer. Dr. Vasquez's expertise is exactly what we need right now. But if we hadn't found her, if she had remained invisible on our streets, we would have lost access to one of our most valuable resources. The president's voice grew more passionate. How many other brilliant minds are we losing to homelessness? How many other potential contributors to our society are we dismissing because they don't look like what we expect success to look like? A reporter from CNN raised his hand. Madam President, what specific role will Dr. Vasquez be playing in your administration? Dr. Vasquez has accepted the position of Special Advisor on Economic Policy, President Harrison announced. She will be working directly with me to address the fiscal challenges facing our nation. Her expertise will be invaluable as we navigate the complex economic landscape ahead. Another reporter asked, Dr. Vasquez, how do you feel about returning to public service after everything you've been through? Elena stepped forward again. I feel grateful for the opportunity to serve my country again, but I also feel a responsibility to use this platform to advocate for the millions of Americans who are struggling with homelessness, poverty, and economic insecurity. My story has a happy ending, but most don't. We need to do better as a society to support our most vulnerable citizens. The questions continue for another 30 minutes, with Elena and President Harrison addressing everything from economic policy to social justice to the specific incident at the coffee shop. By the time the press conference ended, the story was already spreading across social media and news networks. Meanwhile, back at the coffee shop on K Street, Trevor and Patricia were watching the press conference on the television mounted in the corner of the store. The color had drained from their faces as they realized exactly who they had turned away that morning. "Oh my God," Patricia whispered. "We refuse service to the former Secretary of the Treasury." Trevor was staring at the screen in disbelief. She's going to be working in the White House. We kicked out someone who's going to be advising the president. The coffee shop, which had been busy all afternoon, was now completely silent. Every customer was watching the television, and several were looking at the employees with expressions of disgust and disapproval. Patricia's phone rang. It was the owner of the coffee shop, Marcus Wellington, calling from his office in New York. "Patricia, are you watching news?" His voice was tense and angry. "Yes, sir. I'm watching it now." "Do you want to explain to me how my employees refused service to one of the most distinguished public servants in American history?" Patricia felt her stomach drop. "Sir, we didn't know who she was. She looked like a homeless person." "She was a homeless person," Wellington shouted. "That's the entire point. You refuse service to someone based on their appearance. And in doing so, you humiliated a woman who has served this country with distinction for decades." Patricia looked around the coffee shop, noting that several customers were recording the conversation on their phones. "Sir, what do you want me to do?" "I want you to close the store immediately. I want you and Trevor to clean out your lockers. And I want you to pray that Dr. Vasquez is more forgiving than I am, because if she decides to pursue legal action, you'll be on your own." Patricia hung up the phone and turned to Trevor. "We're fired. Both of us." Trevor looked at her in shock. "Fired? For what?" "For refusing service to the former Secretary of the Treasury. For humiliating a woman who is now advising the president. For treating a human being like garbage because of how she looked." As Patricia and Trevor began to understand the magnitude of their mistake, the story was spreading across the internet at viral speed. Video footage of the morning's incident, recorded by customers on their phones, was being shared millions of times. The hashtag Madam Secretary was trending worldwide. Back at the White House, Elena was in her temporary office, already diving into the economic briefing materials that would prepare her for her first official meeting the following morning. Despite everything that had happened, she felt energized in a way she hadn't experienced in years. President Harrison knocked on her door. "Dr. Vasquez, how are you feeling?" "Like I'm home," Elena replied. "Like I'm where I'm supposed to be." "Good, because we have a lot of work to do." The economic challenges we're facing are significant, and I'm going to need your expertise to navigate them successfully. Elena looked up from the briefing materials. Madam President, I want you to know that I don't take this opportunity lightly. I know that my story has resonated with people, but I want to make sure that the focus remains on the policy work and the bigger issues we're trying to address. I understand that, President Harrison said, but I also want you to know that your story has already made a difference. We receive hundreds of calls from people who want to volunteer at homeless shelters, who want to donate to organizations that support people experiencing homelessness, who want to get involved in addressing these issues. Elena felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond her personal circumstances. That's what I hope for. If my experience can help other people, then everything I've been through will have been worth it. As the day ended and Elena prepared to spend her first night in years in actual housing, a temporary apartment arranged by the White House staff, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from a park bench to the halls of power. She had learned that dignity couldn't be taken away by circumstances, that worth wasn't determined by appearance, and that sometimes the most powerful people in the room are the ones that others never see coming. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of serving her country again. But tonight, she would sleep in a real bed, with a roof over her head, and the knowledge that she found her way home. 6 months later, Elena stood before a joint session of Congress, delivering a report on the economic recovery initiatives that had been implemented under her guidance. The American Recovery and Dignity Act, as it had come to be known, had not only addressed the immediate fiscal challenges facing the nation, but had also revolutionized the way the government approached social services and economic support. The legislation had created a comprehensive framework for preventing people from falling through the cracks of the social safety net. It included provisions for emergency housing assistance, medical debt relief, job training programs, and mental health support. Most importantly, it had established the principle that every American deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. Madam Speaker, members of Congress, Elena began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had not only studied economic policy, but had lived its consequences. 6 months ago, I was sleeping on the streets of Washington, D.C. Today, I stand before you not as a symbol of personal redemption, but as living proof that our society's greatest resource is a human potential that we too often overlook. The chamber was completely silent. Elena had become one of the most respected voices in American politics, not because of her dramatic story, but because of her brilliant policy work and her unique perspective on the intersection of economics and human dignity. The policies we have implemented have reduced homelessness by 37% in the past 6 months, Elena continued. We have created over 200,000 jobs through our infrastructure and social services initiatives. We have provided medical debt relief to over 1.2 million Americans. But most importantly, we have begun to change the way our society views and treats its most vulnerable members. Elena paused, looking out at the assembled representatives and senators. But I want to be clear about something. These achievements are not the result of one person's expertise or one administration's policies. They are the result of recognizing that every American has value, that every person's potential, and that our greatest strength as a nation lies not in our ability to accumulate wealth, but in our commitment to ensuring that no one is left behind. The applause was thunderous and sustained. Elena had become not just a policy expert, but a moral voice for the nation. After the speech, Elena returned to her office in the West Wing, an office that had been specially designed to accommodate her unique perspective on both policy and social justice. The walls were lined with economic reports and policy briefs, but they also featured photographs of homeless encampments, letters from people who had been helped by the new legislation, and reminders of the human cost of economic policy. President Harrison was waiting for her. Excellent speech, Dr. Vasquez. Congress is ready to move forward with the next phase of the initiative. Thank you, Madam President. I think we're finally beginning to see the kind of systematic change that can make a real difference in people's lives. There's something else I want to discuss with you. President Harrison said, "I've been thinking about the presidential election next year. I know you said you're not interested in running for office, but I wonder if you'd consider being my running mate." Elena looked at the president with surprise. "Madam President, I appreciate the confidence, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for that kind of role." "Elena, you become one of the most trusted voices in American politics. Your approval ratings are higher than mine. People see you as someone who understands their struggles because you've lived them. I can't think of anyone better qualified to be vice president." Elena walked to the window of her office, looking out at the city where she had once slept on park benches. 6 months ago, I was refused service at a coffee shop. The idea that I could be vice president seems impossible. 6 months ago, you were the same brilliant economist you are today. The only thing that's changed is that people now see you for who you really are. Elena turned back to the president. "Can I think about it?" "Of course. But I want you to know that I believe you could be president someday. And I think the country needs leaders who understand what it means to struggle, who have experienced both the heights and the depths of American society." As Elena considered the president's offer, she thought about her journey from the streets to the halls of power. She had learned that dignity couldn't be taken away by circumstances, that worth wasn't determined by appearance, and that sometimes the most unlikely people could make the biggest difference. Later that evening, Elena made a decision that would surprise everyone, including herself. She called President Harrison and accepted the offer to be her running mate. "I want to do this," Elena said, "not because I'm seeking power, but because I want to make sure that no one else has to experience what I experienced. I want to ensure that our government serves all Americans, not just the ones who look like what we expect success to look like." President Harrison was thrilled. "Elena, this is going to change everything. We're going to show the American people that leadership can come from anywhere. That experience includes all kinds of experiences, and that the best leaders are often the ones who have been tested by life in ways that others haven't." The announcement of Elena's candidacy for vice president sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Critics argued that she was unqualified, that her homelessness was a sign of poor judgment, that she couldn't be trusted with the responsibilities of high office. But the American people saw something different. They saw someone who had overcome extraordinary challenges, who had served with distinction, who understood their struggles because she had lived them. Elena's approval rating soared, and she became one of the most popular political figures in the country. The campaign was unlike anything American politics had ever seen. Elena spoke about economic policy with the expertise of someone who had designed national fiscal strategies. But she also spoke about poverty, homelessness, and social justice with the authority of someone who had experienced them firsthand. At campaign rallies, she would tell her story, not for sympathy, but to illustrate the importance of creating a society where everyone had the opportunity to contribute their talents and abilities. She would talk about the coffee shop incident, not to shame the employees who had refused her service, but to demonstrate how prejudice and assumptions could cause society to overlook its most valuable resources. Trevor and Patricia, the former coffee shop employees, had become unlikely advocates for Elena's campaign. They had both found new jobs and had dedicated themselves to working with homeless advocacy organizations. They spoke publicly about their mistake, using their experience to educate others about the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect. "We learned that day that you can't judge someone by their appearance," Patricia said during a television interview. "Dr. Vasquez taught us that dignity isn't something you can take away from someone, and that worth isn't determined by circumstances." She forgave us for our mistake, and now we're trying to make sure that other people don't make the same mistake we did. The coffee shop on K Street had been transformed into a community center that provided services to homeless individuals and families. Marcus Wellington, the owner, had decided to use the business as a way to address the issues that Elena's story had brought to light. I realized that my business could be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, Wellington said. We're now providing job training, temporary housing assistance, and support services to people who need them. It's a much better use of the space than selling overpriced coffee to people who already have everything they need. On election night, Elena stood on the stage at the victory celebration, having been elected Vice President of the United States. As she looked out at the crowd of supporters, she thought about the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. My fellow Americans, she said, her voice carrying across the packed arena, tonight we have proven that in America, anyone can rise to serve their country. We have shown that worth isn't determined by circumstances, that leadership can come from anywhere, and that our greatest strength lies not in our ability to exclude, but in our commitment to include. The crowd erupted in applause, but Elena wasn't finished. I want to dedicate this victory to every person who has been overlooked, dismissed, or forgotten, to every person who has been judged by their appearance rather than their character, to every person who has been told that they don't belong. Tonight, we have proven that everyone belongs, that everyone has value, and that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. As Elena concluded her speech, she noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was Agent Mitchell, the Secret Service agent who had found her on the park bench 6 months earlier. He was smiling and applauding, and Elena could see tears in his eyes. After the celebration, Elena returned to her hotel room and sat quietly by the window, looking out at the city where her journey had begun. She thought about her husband, Carlos, who had died believing that their struggles had been in vain. She wished he could have seen this moment, could have known that their sacrifice had not been meaningless. She thought about the countless people who were still struggling with homelessness, poverty, and economic insecurity. Her story had a happy ending, but she knew that millions of others were still waiting for their chance to be seen, to be valued, to be given the opportunity to contribute their talents to society. As Vice President, Elena knew that her real work was just beginning. She would use a position to advocate for policies that would prevent others from falling through cracks, that would ensure that everyone had access to the basic necessities of life. That would create a society where dignity was recognized as a fundamental right rather than a privilege. She would never forget the lessons she had learned during her time on the streets, that appearances could be deceiving, that worth wasn't determined by circumstances, and that sometimes the most powerful people in a room were the ones that others never saw coming. The homeless woman who had been refused service at a coffee shop had become the second most powerful person in America. But more importantly, she had become a symbol of hope for everyone who had been told that they didn't matter, that they didn't belong, that they weren't worthy of respect. Elena's story was proof that in America, anyone could rise to serve their country. And as she prepared to take the oath of office as Vice President, she knew that her greatest responsibility would be to ensure that no one else would have to experience what she had experienced. Not because the system had failed them, but because she would work every day to make sure that the system worked for everyone. The coffee shop incident had been a moment of humiliation and pain, but it had also been the beginning of a journey that would transform not just Elena's life, but the way America thought about dignity, worth, and the value of every human being. Sometimes the most unlikely people could make the biggest difference. And sometimes the most powerful person in the room was the one that others never saw coming.